So, hello and welcome back. We are back yet again with Mr. Charles Dickens, where I feel like the plot has started at least, and that's a good thing. The first couple chapters I wasn't quite sure about. It's, again, kind of like some of the other public domain books. It feels very, very much atmosphere, but we're starting to get character, so that's good. That beats Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where I feel like we just didn't get much character. Still, he's got some big shoes to fill. I feel like that's probably a controversial statement to say that Charles Dickens has big shoes to fill when compared to Jules Verne, but that's in my opinion, which is everybody is entitled to their own opinion, which is a good thing. Anyway, with all of that being said and done, it is time to jump back into book one of A Tale of Two Cities, book the first, recalled to life, with chapter, at least chapter 4, possibly chapter 4 and 5. We'll see how it goes. I keep trying to say that I want to keep these to around the 30-minute mark, and then the chapters just don't cooperate. Sometimes they're short, and sometimes they're much longer than I was anticipating. That's okay, though. I like to do 2 chapters, so we'll probably do 2. Anyway, let's jump back into chapter number 5, which is titled The Wine Shop. A large cask of wine had been dropped and broken in the street. This accident had happened in getting it out of a cart. The cask had tumbled out with a run, the hoops had burst, and it lay on the stones just outside the door of the wine shop, shattered like a walnut shell. All of the people within reach had suspended their business or their idleness to run to that spot and drink the wine. The rough, irregular stones of the street, pointing every way, and designed, one might have thought, expressly to lame all living creatures that approached them, had dammed the wine into little pools. These were surrounded, each by its own jostling group or crowd, according to its size. Some men kneeled down and made scoops of their 2 hands joined and sipped, or tried to help women who bent over their shoulders to sip before the wine had run out between their fingers. Others, men and women both, dipped in the puddles with little mugs of mutilated earthenware, or even with handkerchiefs from women's heads, which were squeezed dry into infants' mouths. Others made small mud embankments to stem the wine as it ran. Still others, directed by lookers on up at high windows, darted here and there to cut off little streams of wine that started away in new directions. Even others devoted themselves to the sodden and lead-eyed pieces of the cask, licking and even champing on the moisture wine-rotted fragments with eager relish. There was no drainage to carry off the wine, and not only did it all get taken up, but so much mud got taken up along with it that there might have been a scavenger in the street if anybody acquainted with it could have believed such a miraculous presence. The shrill sound of laughter and of amused voices, voices of men, women, and children, resounded in the street while this wine game lasted. There was little roughness in the sport, and very much playfulness. There was a special companionship in it, an observable inclination on the part of everyone to join some other one, which led, especially among the luckier or lighter hearted, to frolicsome embraces, drinking of health, shaking of hands, even joining of hands and dancing, a dozen altogether. When the wine was gone, and the places where it had been most abundant were raked into the gridiron pattern by fingers, all of these demonstrations ceased as suddenly as they had broken out. The man who had left his saw sticking in the firewood he was cutting set it into motion again. The woman who had left on a doorstep a little pot of hot ashes, at which she had been trying to soften the pain of her own starved fingers and toes, or in those of her child, returned to that. Men with bare arms, matted locks, and cadaverous faces who had emerged into the winter light from cellars moved away to descend again, and a gloom gathered on the scene that appeared more natural to it than sunshine. The wine was a red, and had stained the ground of the narrow street in the suburb of Saint Antoine in Paris, where it had been spilled. It had stained many hands as well, and many faces, and many naked feet, and many wooden shoes. The hands of the man who sawed the wood left red marks on the billets, and the forehead of the woman who nursed her baby was stained with the stain of the old rag she had wound about her head again. Those who had been greedy with the staves of the cask had acquired a tigerish smear around their mouth, and one joker, so besmirched, his head more out of a long squalid bag of a nightcap than inside of it, scrawled upon a wall with his finger dipped in muddy wine lees the word blood. The time was to come when that wine too would be spilled on the streets, and when the stain of it would be read upon many there. And now that cloud settled on Saint Antoine, which a momentary gleam had driven from his sacred countenance. The darkness of it was heavy, the cold, dirt, sickness, ignorance, and want. Those were the lords in waiting on the saintly presence, nobles of great power, all of them, but most especially the last. Samples of a people that had undergone a terrible grinding and regrinding in the mill, and certainly not in the fabulous mill which ground old people young, shivered in every corner, passed in and out of every doorway, and looked from every window. It fluttered in every vestige of a garment that the wind was shaking. The mill which had worked them down was the mill that grinds young people into old. The children had ancient faces and grave voices, and upon them and upon the faces of the grown-ups, and plowed into every furrow of age and coming up afresh was the sign, hunger. It was prevalent everywhere. Hunger was pushed out of the tall houses in the wretched clothing that hung upon the poles and the lines. Hunger was patched into them with straw and rag and wood and paper. Hunger was repeated in every fragment of that small modicum of firewood that the man had sawed off. Hunger stared down from the smokeless chimneys and started up from the filthy street that had no offal among its refuse. Nothing to eat. Hunger was the inscription in the baker's shelves, written in every small loaf of his scanty stock of bad bread, at the sausage shop, in every dead dog preparation that was offered for sale. Hunger rattled its dry bones among the rotting chestnuts in the turned cylinder. Hunger was shred into atomies in every farthing porringer of husky chips of potatoes fried with reluctant drops of oil. Its abiding place was in all things that were fit to it, a narrow winding street, full of offense and stench, with other narrow winding streets diverging, all peopled by rags and nightcaps, and all smelling of rags and nightcaps, and all visible things with a brooding look upon them that looked ill. In the hunted air of the people there was yet some wild beast thought of the possibility of turning at bay. Depressed and slinking though they were, eyes of fire were not wanting among them, nor compressed lips white with what they suppressed, nor foreheads knitted in the likeness of the gallows rope that they mused about, either enduring or inflicting. The trade signs, and they were almost as many as the shops, were all grim illustrations of want. The butcher and the porkman painted up only the leanest scraps of meat, the baker the coarsest of meager loaves, the people rudely pictured as drinking in the wine slops croaked over their scanty measures of thin wine and beer, and were confidential together. Nothing was repressed in a flourishing condition save tools and weapons, but the cutler's knives and axes were sharp and bright. The smith's hammers were heavy, and the gunmaker's stock was murderous. The crippling stones of the pavement, with their many little reservoirs of mud and water, had no footways but broke off abruptly at the doors. The kennel, to make amends, ran down the middle of the street, when it ran at all, which was only after heavy rain, and then it ran by many eccentric fits into the houses. Across the streets, at wide intervals, one clumsy lamp was slung by a rope and pulley. At night, when the lamplighter had let these down and lighted and hoisted them again, a feeble grove of dim wicks swung in a sickly manner overhead, almost as though they were at sea. Indeed, they were at sea, and the ship and that crew in peril of tempest. For the time was to come when the gaunt scarecrows of that region should have watched the lamplighter in their idleness and hunger so long as to conceive the idea of improving upon his method and hauling up men by those same ropes and pulleys to flare upon the darkness of their condition. But that time was not come yet, and every wind that blew over France shook the rags of the scarecrows in vain, for the birds, fine of song and feather, took no warning. The wine shop was a corner shop, better than most others in appearance and degree, and the master of the wine shop had stood outside it, in a yellow waistcoat and green breeches, looking on at the struggle for the lost wine. "It's not my affair," he said, with a final shrug of his shoulders. "The people from the market did it. Let them bring me another." There, his eyes happening to catch the tall joker writing up his joke, called to him, "Say then, my Gaspard, what do you do there?" The fellow pointed to his joke with immense significance, as is often the way with his tribe. It missed the mark and completely failed, as is often the way with that tribe as well. "What now? Are you a subject for a mad hospital?" said the wine shop keeper, crossing the road and obliterating the jest with a handful of mud picked up for the purpose and smeared over it. "Why do you write in the public streets? Tell me thou, is there no other place to write such words in?" In his exposition, he dropped his cleaner hand, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not, upon the joker's heart. The joker rapped it with his own, took a nimble spring upwards, and came down in a fantastic dancing attitude, with one of his stained shoes jerked off of his foot into his hand and held out. A joker of an extremely, not to say wolfishly, practical character, he looked under those circumstances. Put it on, he said. "Call wine, wine, and finish there." And with that advice, he wiped his soiled hand upon the joker's dress, such as it was, quite deliberately, as having dirtied the hand on his account, and then the wine seller recrossed the road and entered his shop. The wine shop keeper was a bull-necked, martial-looking man of about 30, and he should have been of hot temperament, for although it was a bitter day, he wore no coat, but he carried one slung over his shoulder. His shirt sleeves were rolled up too, and his brown arms bare to the elbow. Neither did he wear anything more on his head than his own crisply curling, short, dark hair. He was a dark man altogether, with good eyes and a good bold breadth between them. Good humored looking on the whole, but implacable looking as well. Evidently a man of strong resolution and a set purpose, a man not desirable to be met rushing down a narrow pass with a gulf on either side, for nothing would turn this man. Madame Defarge, his wife, sat in the shop behind the counter as he came in. Madame Defarge was a stout woman of about his own age, with a watchful eye that seldom seemed to look at anything, a large hand, heavily ringed, a steady face, strong features, and a great composure of manner. There was a character about Madame Defarge from which one might have predicted that she did not often make mistakes against herself in any of the reckonings over which she presided. Madame Defarge, being sensitive to cold, was wrapped in fur and had a quantity of bright shawl twined about her head, though not to the concealment of her large earrings. Her knitting was before her, but she had laid it down to pick her teeth with a toothpick. Thus engaged, with her right elbow supported by her left hand, Madame Defarge said nothing when her lord came in, but coughed. Just one grain of a cough. This, in combination with the lifting of her darkly defined eyebrows over her toothpick by the breadth of a line, suggested to her husband that he would do well to look around the shop amongst the customers for any new customer who had dropped in while he had stepped out of the way. The wine shopkeeper accordingly rolled his eyes about until they rested upon an elderly gentleman and a young lady who were seated in the corner. Other company were there, 2 playing cards, 2 playing dominoes, 3 standing by the counter lengthening out a short supply of wine. As the man passed behind the counter, he took notice that the elderly gentleman said, in a look to the young lady, "This is our man." "What the devil do you do in that gallery there?" said Monsieur Defarge to himself. "I don't know you." But he feigned not to notice the 2 strangers, and fell into discourse with the triumvirate of customers who were drinking at the counter. "How goes it, Jacques?" said one of these 3 to Monsieur Defarge. "Is all the spilt wine swallowed?" "Every drop, Jacques," said Monsieur Defarge. When this interchange of Christian name was effected, Madame Defarge, picking her teeth with her toothpick, coughed another grain of a cough, and raised her eyebrows by the breadth of another line. "It is not often," said the second of the 3 men to Monsieur Defarge, "that any of these miserable beasts know even the taste of wine, or of anything but black bread and death. Is that not so, Jacques?" "It is so, Jacques," said Monsieur Defarge. At this second interchange of Christian names, Madame Defarge, still using her toothpick with profound composure, coughed another grain of a cough, and raised her eyebrows by the breadth of another line. The last of the 3 now had his say, as he put down his empty drinking vessel and smacked his lips. "Ah, so much the worst. A bitter taste it is that such poor cattle always have in their mouths, and hard lives they live, Jacques. Am I right, Jacques?" "You are right, Jacques," was the response of Monsieur Defarge. This third interchange of the Christian name was completed at the moment when Madame Defarge put her toothpick by, kept her eyebrows out, and slightly rustled in her seat. "Hold, then, true," said her husband. "Gentlemen, my wife." The 3 customers pulled off their hats to Madame Defarge with 3 flourishes. She acknowledged their homage by bending her head and giving them a quick look. Then she glanced in a casual manner around the wine shop, took up her knitting with great apparent calmness and repose of spirit, and became absorbed in it. "Gentlemen," said Monsieur Defarge, who had kept his bright eye observantly upon her, "good day. The chamber, furnished bachelor fashion, that you wished to see and were inquiring for when I stopped out, is on the 5th floor. The doorway of the staircase gives out on the little courtyard close to the left over there." He pointed, "near to the window of my establishment, but now that I remember, one of you has already been there and can show the way. Gentlemen, adieu." They paid for their wine, and they left the place. The eyes of Monsieur Defarge were studying his wife at her knitting, when the elderly gentleman advanced from his corner and begged the favor of a word. "Willingly, sir," said Monsieur Defarge, and he quietly stepped with him to the door. Their conference was very short, but very decided. Almost at the very first word, Monsieur Defarge started and then became deeply attentive. It had not lasted a minute when he then nodded and went out. The gentleman then beckoned to the young lady, and they too went out. Madame Defarge knitted with nimble fingers and steady eyebrows, and saw nothing. Mr. Jarvis Lorry and Miss Manette, emerging from the wine shop thusly, joined Monsieur Defarge in the doorway to which he had directed his other company just before. It opened from a stinking little black courtyard, and was the general public entrance to a great pile of houses inhabited by a great number of people. In the gloomy tile-paved entry to the gloomy tile-paved staircase, Monsieur Defarge bent down on one knee to the child of his old master, and he put her hand to his lips. It was a gentle action, but not at all gently done. A very remarkable transformation had come over him in just a few seconds. He had no good humor in his face, nor any openness of aspect left. His face had become secret, angry. He had become a dangerous man. "It is very high. It is a little difficult. Better to begin slowly." Thus Monsieur Defarge, in a stern voice to Mr. Lorry as they began ascending the stairs. "Is he alone?" whispered Mr. Lorry. "Alone? God help him, who should be with him?" said Monsieur Defarge. "Is he always alone, then?" "Yes." "Of his own desire?" "Of his own necessity, as he was when I first saw him after they found me, and demanded to know if I would take him, and at my peril be discreet about it. As he was then, he is now." "He is greatly changed?" "Changed?" The keeper of the wine shop stopped to strike the wall with his hand and mutter a tremendous curse. No direct answer could have been half so forcible. Mr. Lorry's spirits grew heavier and heavier as he and his two companions went higher and higher. Such a staircase, with its accessories, in the older and more crowded parts of Paris, would be bad enough now, but at that time it was vile indeed to unaccustomed and unhardened senses. Every little habitation within the great foul nest of the one high building, that is to say, the room or rooms within every door that opened on the general staircase, left its own heap of refuse upon its own landing, besides flinging out other refuse from open windows. The uncontrollable, hopeless mass of decomposition so engendered would have polluted the air even if the poverty and deprivation had not loaded it with their own impurities. The two bad sources combined made everything almost insupportable. Through such an atmosphere, by a steep, dark shaft of dirt and poison, that was the way their way lay. Yielding to his own disturbance of mind and to his young companion's agitation, which had become greater every instant, Mr. Jarvis Lorry twice stopped to rest. Each of these stoppages was made at a doleful grating, which, by any languishing good airs that were left uncorrupted, seemed to be escaping, and all spoiled and sickly vapors seemed to come in. Through the rusted bars, tastes rather than glimpses were caught of the jumbled neighborhood, and nothing within range, nearer or lower than the summits of the two great towers of Notre Dame, had any promise in it of healthy life or wholesome aspiration. Finally, the top of the staircase was gained, and they stopped for the third time. There was yet an upper staircase, of a steeper inclination and of contracted dimensions, yet to be ascended, before the garret story was finally reached. The keeper of the wine shop, always going a little in advance, and always going on the side which Mr. Lorry took, as though he dreaded to be asked any questions by the young lady, turned himself about here, and, carefully feeling in the pockets of the coat he carried over his shoulder, removed a key. "The door is locked, then, my friend?" said Mr. Lorry, surprised. "Aye, yes," said Monsieur Defarge. "You think it necessary to keep the unfortunate gentleman so retired?" "I think it necessary to turn the key," Monsieur Defarge said, and he frowned. "Why?" "Why? Because he has lived so long locked up that he would be frightened, or rave, tear himself to pieces, die, come to I know not what harm, if I left the door open." "Is it possible?" said Mr. Lorry. "Is it possible?" said Defarge. "Yes. And a beautiful world we live in, when it is possible, and when many other such things are possible. Not only possible, but done, see you, under that sky there every day. Long live the devil. Let's go on." This dialogue had been held in so very low a whisper that not a word of it had reached the young lady's ears. By this time, she was trembling under such strong emotion, and her face expressed such deep anxiety, and above all dread and terror, that Mr. Lorry felt it incumbent upon him to speak a word or two of reassurance. "Courage, dear miss, courage! Business! The worst will be over in a moment. It is but passing the room door, and the worst is over. Then all the good you bring to him, all the relief, all the happiness you bring to him will begin. Let our good friend here assist you on that side. That's well, friend Defarge. Come now, business, business." They went up slowly and softly. The staircase was short, and they were soon at the top. There, as it had an abrupt turn in it, they came all at once in the sight of three men, whose heads were bent down close together at the side of a door, and who were intently looking into the room to which the door belonged through some chinks or holes in the wall. Upon hearing footsteps close at hand, these three turned and rose, and showed themselves to be the three of one name who had been drinking in the wine shop. "I forgot them in the surprise of your visit," said Monsieur Defarge. "Leave us, good boys, we have business here." The three glided by and silently went down. There appeared to be no other door on that floor, and the keeper of the wine shop going straight to this one when they were left alone. Mr. Lorry asked in a whisper that held a bit of anger, "Do you make a show of Monsieur Manette?" "I show, in the way you have seen, to a chosen few." "Is that well?" "I think it is well." "Who are the few? How do you choose them?" "I choose them as real men, of my name. Jacques is my name, to whom the sight is likely to do good. Enough, you are English, that is another thing. Stay there, if you please, a moment." And with an admonitory gesture to keep them back, he stooped and looked in through a crevice in the wall. Soon, raising his head again, he struck twice or thrice upon the door, evidently with no other object than to make a noise. With that same intention, he drew the key across it 3 or 4 times before putting it clumsily into the lock, and turned it as loudly as he could. The door slowly opened inward under his hand, and he looked into the room and said something. A faint voice answered something. Little more than a single syllable could have been spoken on either side. Then he looked back over his shoulder and beckoned them to enter. Mr. Lorry got his arm securely around the daughter's waist and held her, for he could feel she was sinking. "Business, business," he urged, with a moisture that was not business shining upon his cheek. "Come in, come in." "I'm afraid of it," she answered with a shudder. "Of it? What?" "I mean of him, of my father." Rendered in a manner desperate by her state, and by the beckoning of their conductor, Mr. Lorry drew over his neck the arm that shook upon his shoulder, lifted her a little, and hurried her into the room. He set her down just within the door, and held her, clinging to him. Defarge drew out the key, closed the door, and locked it on the inside, and took the key out again and held it in his hand. All this he did methodically, and with as loud and harsh an accompaniment of noise as he could make. Finally, he walked across the room with a measured tread to where the window was, and he stopped there and turned around. The garret, built to be a dry depository for firewood and the like, was dim and dark, for the window, of a dormer shape, was in truth a door in the roof, and with a little crane over it for the hoisting up of stores from the street. It was unglazed, and closing up the middle in 2 pieces, like any other door of French construction. To exclude the cold, one half of this door was fast closed, and the other was opened only a little way. Such a scanty portion of light was admitted through these means that it was difficult, on first coming in, to see anything, and long habit alone could have slowly formed in anyone the ability to do any work requiring nicety in this obscurity. Yet work of that kind was being done in the garret. For with his back towards the door and his face towards the window where the keeper of the wine shop stood looking at him, a white-haired man sat on a low bench, stooping forward, and very busily was making shoes. And that, odd chapter, was the end of chapter 5, and that was right at 30 minutes, so that is definitely, we're going to do 1 chapter tonight. It's kind of nice to be back to being able to do 1 a night instead of 2 a night because they're short, so that's good. All right, so I have no idea who Monsieur Manette is actually supposed to be in the French Revolution. I swear I've read this book, but it was in 7th grade, and that was like 30 years ago or more. More. Wow, I'm old. Anyway, it's been a long time, so this is kind of like reading it for the first time. And maybe it is reading it for the first time. Interesting. I liked the description of the spilled wine. I feel like that should be animated by somebody with way more talent than me. Just people spilling out drinking wine off the streets. It also kind of reminds me, I think they said in the Great Molasses Flood of, I think, Chicago, or was it Boston, that people were doing the same thing. They were rushing out into the streets and just scooping up molasses. But people are people. I also feel really bad for all the people in Paris because it sounds like they are in dire straits, which is probably what will lead to the French Revolution. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that chapter. Please do join me again tomorrow. Leave me a thumbs up on your way out, and I will see you then.